The drizzle was cold, a bitter punctuation to the pre-dawn light of June 10, 1944. From his concealed observation post in the ruins of a church steeple near Longues-sur-Mer, Oberleutnant Franz Wegner, an artillery spotter for the Artillery Regiment 1716, swept his Zeiss binoculars over the coastline. For 4 days his world had been thunder. He had directed his 150-meter guns against the beaches, watching shells tear holes in the landing craft, expecting the sea to turn back the invasion. The doctrine was clear: repel them at the water's edge. He expected chaos, desperation, a beachhead clogged with wreckage and drowning men. He saw the wreckage. But he also saw, emerging from the mist off the beach codenamed Gold by the British, something impossible. It was not a fleet. It was a city. A line of sunken ships, ghosts sacrificed to the tide, formed a breakwater. Beyond them, massive, multi-story concrete blocks sat in the deep water, arranged in a perfect geometric crescent. Most horrifying of all, a long, flexible pier snaked from the shore over the waves to a steel platform where ships were not beaching, but docking. A truck, tiny at this distance, was driving on the water. Wegner stared, his knuckles white on the binoculars. This was not an invasion. This was an occupation. The old belief, the core assumption of Festung Europa, was that no army could be supplied over an open beach. The Oberkommando had promised that without a deep-water port like Cherbourg, the Allies would starve. Yet here, rising from the sea at Arromanches, was the port. They had brought it with them. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Franz Wegner lowered his optics, his heart cold with a realization that had not yet reached the bunkers in Berlin. He had trained for years to spot weaknesses, to direct fire onto massing infantry or armored columns. What he saw now had no precedent in any military manual. His reports since D-Day had been frantic, detailing the sheer mass of the Allied landing. But his superiors at the 716 Infantry Division headquarters were focused on the tactical fight. The defense of Caen, the counterattacks by the 21 Panzer Division. They were filtering his reports, dismissing the impossible as battlefield hysteria. His sighting of giant concrete blocks being towed across the channel on D+1 was marked as unverified, likely misidentified landing craft. Now, on D+4, the misidentified craft formed an unwavering line against the brutal Atlantic swell. Wegner watched a British LST landing ship tank nose up to one of the pierheads. Its bow doors opened, and a Sherman tank rolled out onto the steel platform, its tracks clattering. It did not wade through the surf. It drove, perfectly dry, onto the serpentine roadway, a roadway that flexed with the waves and trundled onto French soil. It was followed by another, and another. Then came the trucks, loaded with ammunition crates and fuel barrels. The speed was mechanical, relentless. It was the speed of a factory. He grabbed his field telephone, bypassing his immediate command. He had to reach someone at Heeresgruppe B. "This is Term 3, he barked, using his call sign. "Target Arromanches. I am not reporting ships. I am reporting a Hafen, a complete harbor. It is operational. I repeat, they are unloading tanks dry. The invasion cannot be stopped at the beach. It is already supplied." The line crackled with static and disbelief. The officer on the other end demanded coordinates, but his tone was dismissive. They thought he was describing a few lucky beachings. They could not comprehend what he was seeing. The German strategic assumption, the foundation of Field Marshal Rommel's entire defense plan, was built on a single immovable fact: logistics. An invasion force of this magnitude, which Allied radio intercepts, decoded by the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, suggested would grow to over 1 million men, required a deep-water port. The Kriegsmarine analysts and OKW planners had run the numbers. To supply just one armored division in combat required over 600 tons of supplies per day. The Allies were landing dozens of divisions. Without a port, they needed thousands of tons of materiel: food, bullets, gasoline, medical supplies, replacement parts, delivered every single day. The planners calculated that even with total air superiority, unloading over open beaches, relying on small craft and DUKW amphibious trucks, was suicidally inefficient. The best they could manage, OKW projected, was perhaps 500 tons per day, per beach. The invasion force would consume supplies faster than they could be landed. By D+10, the spearhead would run out of fuel and ammunition. That is when the panzer reserves, held back for this precise moment, would strike, annihilating the weakened beachhead. What Wegener didn't know was that this ghost city, this Mulberry Harbor, was designed to deliver 12,000 tons per day. The historical problem was brutal and unambiguous. It was defined by the failure of the Dieppe raid on August 19, 1942. The operation, codenamed Jubilee, was a catastrophe designed to test the Atlantic Wall. The 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, supported by British commandos, was ordered to assault the port of Dieppe directly. The plan assumed that tactical surprise and armored support, Churchill tanks landed on the beach, could overcome the fixed fortifications. The assumption was wrong. The German 302nd Static Infantry Division, dug into the cliffs, annihilated the attackers. The tanks were trapped on the steep pebble beach. The engineers could not clear the obstacles under fire. In less than 9 hours, of the 086 men who landed, 367 were killed, wounded, or captured. The lesson, learned in Canadian blood, was stark. The Atlantic Wall was too strong. Taking a fortified port like Calais, Le Havre, or Cherbourg by frontal assault was impossible. The cost would bleed the Allies dry before they ever broke inland. This conclusion paralyzed Allied planning for nearly a year. A memo circulated from the desk of the Chief of Staff to the Supreme Allied Commander, Cossack, in early 1943, laid out the paradox. Option 1. Land at a port and be destroyed by the defenses. Option 2. Land on an open, undefended beach and be destroyed by the lack of supply. German intelligence, having studied the Dieppe after-action reports, came to the same conclusion. They heavily fortified the ports and lightly defended the beaches, confident that any landing on the long sandy stretches of Normandy would be a temporary lodgment, a logistical failure in the making. This single problem, the port versus beach dilemma, became the central obsession of Allied High Command. The entire invasion, the liberation of Europe, hinged on solving it. The math was relentless. Planners at the British War Office estimated that by D+30, the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHEF, would need to have landed over 160 Isauran vehicles and 1.5 million men. The daily supply requirement to keep this force moving was calculated at 25 Adosaran tons. This was the tonnage of a major industrial city. To land it over an open beach, using amphibious trucks and beached landing craft was pure fantasy. The English Channel was notoriously volatile. A 3-day storm, common even in June, would halt all unloading operations, strand the army, and hand the decisive victory to Rommel's waiting panzers. The invasion plan, as it stood in early 1943, was a suicide note. The numbers on the page were cold, but the reality on the beaches of Normandy during the first 48 hours was a nightmare of human suffering and logistical chaos. At Omaha Beach, the men of the 299th Combat Engineer Battalion, tasked with clearing obstacles, were cut down in the surf. Men of the 116th Infantry Regiment, weighed down by 80 pounds of gear, drowned in water just 6 feet deep, pulled under by the savage tidal current. LSTs, vital for landing tanks, broached in the surf, slammed by waves and targeted by German 80mm guns. They became burning wrecks that further blocked the beach. The meticulously planned waves of landings dissolved into a desperate scramble for survival. For the first 2 days, the beachhead was starving. Wounded men lay on the wet sand for hours, waiting for evacuation. Radios failed, soaked in salt water. Platoons ran out of mortar rounds. Medics ran out of plasma. The beaches were a tangle of burned-out jeeps, drowned trucks, and exhausted, terrified men. The supply chain was not a chain at all. It was a bucket brigade in a hurricane. Every case of K rations, every box of .30 caliber ammunition, every 5-gallon jerry can of fuel had to be manhandled from a landing craft, waded through chest-deep water, and dragged up the shingle under sporadic shell fire. This was the acceptable cost. But the planners at Chaff knew this state of affairs was unsustainable. The critical variable was the weather. The entire operation was balanced on the hope that the notoriously fickle English Channel would remain calm for weeks. A severe summer gale, which meteorological records showed was statistically likely, would not just delay supplies. It would destroy the makeshift beachhead entirely. It would smash the smaller landing craft, strand the LSTs, and cut the artery. The German High Command was counting on it. Their strategy was simple: hold the line, let the weather and the friction of combat exhaust the Allies, and then strike. The experts on both sides agreed. Without a port, the invasion was temporary. It couldn't be done. The idea that broke this deadlock did not come from a famous general, but from a memorandum written after the Dieppe disaster. Commodore John Hughes Hallett, the naval commander of the failed raid, was steaming back to Portsmouth, surrounded by the wreckage of his fleet and the few survivors. He remarked to his staff, with grim finality, "If we cannot capture a port, we shall have to take one with us." This statement, born of failure, landed on the desk of Vice Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten, the head of Combined Operations. Combined Operations was a rogue element within the British military, a hub of eccentrics, inventors, and mad scientists explicitly tasked with solving impossible problems. Among them was a man named Geoffrey Pike, a civilian intellectual who had previously proposed building aircraft carriers out of pikecrete, a mixture of ice and wood pulp. While pikecrete was deemed impractical, Pike's lateral thinking was exactly what Mountbatten valued. But the most critical contribution came from a quiet, pragmatic engineer, Major Alan Beckett of the Royal Engineers. Beckett was a civil engineer in peacetime, a man who understood steel, stress, and tidal forces. He wasn't a grand strategist, he was a builder. He was tasked with designing not the whole harbor, but its most critical component, the roadway. The concept that emerged, codenamed Mulberry, was audacious. It would be a complete, prefabricated harbor, built in secret in England, towed across the Channel, and assembled off the coast of Normandy under fire. It would consist of 3 main parts. First, a breakwater, made by sinking 70 old merchant ships, codenamed Gooseberries, and 146 massive, hollow concrete caissons, some 200 feet long and 60 feet high, codenamed Phoenix. Second, floating pierheads, spuds, that could rise and fall with the 20-foot Normandy tide. And third, the whale, Beckett's invention. This was the floating roadway, a flexible steel bridge held up by beetle pontoons, connecting the pierheads to the beach. The first conflict was not with the Germans, but with the British establishment. When the plan was presented at a War Office meeting in 1943, it was met with incredulity. "You want to tow buildings across the Channel?" One air marshal reportedly scoffed. "The Luftwaffe will sink them in an hour." Naval commanders argued the structures would never survive the Channel's currents, let alone a storm. The resources required were staggering: over 1 million tons of concrete, 100,000 tons of steel. It would consume the entire industrial capacity of southern England, diverting resources from bomber production and shipbuilding. It was, in the words of one planner, a stupid idea. But the idea had a powerful, impatient sponsor. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, tired of the bureaucratic paralysis, reviewed the concept. He grabbed a memo outlining the difficulties and scrawled a furious note across the top. Piers for use on beaches. They must float up and down with the tide. Don't argue the matter. The difficulties will argue for themselves. With that, the argument was over. The impossible idea became official policy. The preparation was one of the greatest industrial secrets of the war. The work was scattered across Great Britain to hide it from Luftwaffe reconnaissance. The 146 Phoenix caissons, the concrete behemoths that would form the main breakwater, were built in flooded dry docks and quiet estuaries along the Thames and the south coast. Thousands of civilian workers, including many women, labored day and night, pouring concrete, unaware of what they were building. They were told it was for unspecified coastal defenses. Simultaneously, the whale roadways, thousands of feet of articulated steel bridge, were being forged in factories in Wales and Scotland. The secret test was conducted far from prying eyes, in the quiet, remote waters of the Solway Firth in Scotland. At Wigtown Harbour, Alan Beckett and a team of Royal Engineers assembled their prototype. Beckett, the quiet engineer, was obsessive. He knew the establishment was waiting for his toy to fail. He worked alongside his men, knee-deep in the cold mud, checking the articulated joints and the kite anchors he had designed to hold the flexible roadway fast against the current. The naval observers, dispatched by skeptical admirals, watched from the shore, arms crossed. They knew what a Scottish gale could do. This flimsy-looking bridge, held up by little steel boxes, didn't stand a chance. The first tests were failures. Early designs for the pierheads were too rigid. A minor storm in the Firth snapped mooring lines and twisted the steel. The observers took notes, their skepticism confirmed. Beckett, however, was learning. He realized the structures couldn't fight the sea. They had to move with it. His whale roadway was designed for 6 degrees of freedom, allowing it to twist, pitch, and heave without breaking. His kite anchors were revolutionary, digging deeper into the seabed as the force upon them increased. In early 1944, they assembled the final prototype. As if on cue, a severe gale swept in from the Irish Sea, battering the Scottish coast with 50-knot winds and 15-foot waves. The team retreated to the shore, watching their creation battered by the storm. For 2 days, the whale roadway was assaulted by the sea. When the storm finally broke, the observers gathered at dawn, expecting to see a twisted pile of wreckage. Instead, the roadway was still there. It had risen and fallen with the tide. It had flexed and twisted with the waves. But it had held. The kite anchors had not dragged a single inch. Beckett had done it. He had designed a bridge that could ride out a hurricane. The stunned naval observers filed a report that electrified the War Office. The circus, as the skeptics called it, was going to work. If stories like this fascinate you, stay with us. The next chapter of wartime innovation might surprise you. The components were assembled into 2 massive secret fleets, codenamed Mulberry A, for the Americans at Omaha Beach, and Mulberry B, for the British and Canadians at Arromanches. The Zoo, as the collection of bizarrely shaped barges, concrete blocks, and steel piers was known, set sail on D-Day itself, a slow-moving 150-mile-long procession of the strangest armada in history. The institutional confrontation was no longer with skeptical admirals in London. It was with the chaos of the battlefield. The men tasked with assembling this harbor were not ordinary soldiers. They were the U.S. Navy Seabees, construction battalions, and the British Royal Engineers. The defense of the idea fell to these men. When the components arrived off Omaha Beach on D+1, the beach was still under heavy fire. The beachmaster, fighting a desperate battle to clear wrecked vehicles and land combat troops, saw the arrival of the Gooseberry block ships as a hindrance, not a help. "I've got no room for this junk," he roared at the naval officer in charge of the scuttling. "Get these targets out of here!" The confrontation was immediate. Stop the war to build, or build during the war. The officer, Captain A.D. Clark of the U.S. Navy, made his defense. He signaled back, "Orders from Chaff are absolute. The breakwater will be established. We are sinking the first ship at 1900 hours." The Seabees and engineers went to work under aimed mortar and artillery fire. They were builders, not infantry, but they fought their own war. They wrestled the massive Phoenix caissons into place, flooding their compartments with precision, while German 88 Nabrierer shells kicked up plumes of water around them. Tugs, commanded by men who had skippered barges on the Thames, now maneuvered 6,000-ton concrete blocks into a perfect line. Men dived into the cold water to secure tow lines. They worked for 72 hours without sleep, drinking coffee brewed on the decks of their tugs, motivated by a single terrifying deadline: the first storm. They were not just building a port. They were in a race against the weather. Their passionate defense of the project was not spoken in a tribunal. It was written in sweat, steel, and concrete on the coastline of Normandy. By the morning of June 10, 1944, Oberleutnant Franz Wegener was witnessing the result of that race. From his church steeple he had a clear view of Mulberry Bee at Arromanches, which the British had already nicknamed Port Winston. The Gooseberry ships were sunk. The Phoenix caissons were in place. The whale roadways stretched 3,000 feet from the beach to the spud pierheads. The sight was surreal. It was a functioning industrial harbor, sitting in open water that, 4 days prior, had been an empty, defended beach. His gaze followed a single impossible procession. A massive American LST, designated LST-356, carefully reversed its stern toward one of the pierheads. It didn't beach, it docked. A ramp was lowered. Within minutes, a column of U.S. Army 2.5-ton deuce-and-a-half trucks began to roll off the ship, onto the pier, and down Alan Beckett's flexible steel roadway. They hit the sand of France with their cargo holds full and their tires dry. Wegener watched, mesmerized by the efficiency. There was no waiting, no chaos, no bottleneck. It was a continuous mechanical flow. As soon imj, a British transport ship was unloading crates of artillery shells. A DUKW amphibious truck sputtered past, looking like a relic from a previous, more primitive war. Wegener lowered his binoculars. The realization was no longer an intellectual concept. It was a physical sickness. The Artillery Regiment 1716 could shell the beaches, but they could not shell the ocean. The 21 Panzer Division could fight for Caen, but they could not fight this. This was not a battle of tactics. It was a battle of industry. The Allies had not just broken the Atlantic Wall. They had rendered it irrelevant. They didn't need to capture a port. They had built a superior one. Wegener knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that his superiors in Berlin, still moving pins on a map and counting panzer divisions, had no idea what had happened. The war of logistics had been lost, not in a great battle, but in the quiet, methodical assembly of concrete and steel. The invasion was no longer an if. It was permanent. The ultimate vindication of the Mulberry Harbors arrived on June 19, 1944. A furious storm, the worst to hit the English Channel in over 40 years, blew in from the northeast. For 3 days, winds gusted to 60 miles per hour, and 20-foot waves battered the Normandy coast. It was the exact scenario the German High Command had predicted, and the Allied planners had feared. The storm halted all unloading at the open beaches of Utah and Sword. It smashed hundreds of smaller landing craft, tossing them onto the shore like toys. It was a meteorological catastrophe. At Omaha Beach, the American-built Mulberry A was destroyed. It had been assembled more quickly, perhaps with less attention to the flexible tolerances that Beckett had insisted upon. The storm tore its whale roadways apart and ripped the Phoenix caissons from their moorings, leaving it a useless wreck. The American forces were forced to revert to the old chaotic method of beaching LSTs. But at Arromanches, Mulberry B, Port Winston, held. Alan Beckett's Whale roadways, which the skeptics had called flimsy, rose and fell, twisted and flexed, and rode out the storm. The kite anchors held the pierheads fast. Though damaged, Port Winston was operational again in days. It became the single most important asset in Europe. With Mulberry A gone, all priority supplies for the British, Canadian, and American armies were funneled through this one prefabricated port. The statistics were staggering. In its 100 days of operation, before the port of Antwerp was finally captured and cleared, Port Winston landed 5 million men, 500,000 vehicles, and 4 million tons of supplies. It was the artery that fed the entire Normandy breakout, the Cobra offensive, and the race across France. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, would later state that this simple if large-scale technical trick had been the decisive factor. The Germans, with their rigid focus on fortifications, had been defeated by a flexible idea. Alan Beckett, the quiet engineer, was awarded the Order of the British Empire. After the war, he returned to his civil engineering practice, his name largely unknown, even as the roll-on, roll-off, ro-ro ferry terminals he pioneered became the global standard for maritime transport. The legacy of the Mulberry Harbor is not just in the massive concrete caissons that still litter the seabed off Arromanches, visited by tourists and scuba divers. Its true legacy is the triumph of ingenuity over doctrine. The German High Command was defeated because its strategic assumptions were brittle. They prepared for a war of fortification, a rigid defense that would break the enemy. The Allies, forced by the failure at Dieppe, embraced a solution that was the opposite. It was temporary, modular, and above all, flexible. Alan Beckett's Whale roadway succeeded where rigid steel failed, because it adapted to the chaotic power of the ocean. It did not try to defy it. This principle, flexibility in the face of an overwhelming chaotic environment, is the direct ancestor of all modern rapid deployment logistics. When a 21st-century earthquake or tsunami destroys a nation's port, the temporary floating piers, like the U.S. Navy's Joint Logistics Over the Shore, or JLOTS, systems, that are flown in to deliver humanitarian aid, are the direct descendants of the whale and the beetle. The war was won not by the men who built the thickest walls, but by the men who designed the most adaptable bridges. The concrete ruins off the French coast are not tombs. They are silent witnesses to the moment a quiet engineer, by respecting the power of the sea, defeated an empire that believed it was immovable. Every great idea begins as an act of defiance against impossibility. What impossible ideas do you think could change the world?